Usually in any ecosystem, the interaction between the living organism is not just a simple food chain. Usually it's an interconnected food chains, because a living organism, especially the top carnivores, you will find them feeding on different food chains, and they feed in different trophic levels. Okay? For example, in an ecosystem, we can have the grass as the producer. And we have several primary consumers feeding on the grass. We have a cow feeding on the grass, we have rabbits, and we have caterpillars or grasshoppers. Okay? So all of these are primary consumers. They are second trophic levels. The grasshoppers are fed upon by birds. The rabbits are eaten by fox. The cows,
Humans.
humans, and ticks or fleas. So the fleas, they suck the blood from the cow, so they are taking their energy from the cow. And the birds can be eaten by snakes or by the fox, and the fox can be eaten by a lion. Okay? So this is an interconnected food chain. Okay, ممكن الفيس كمان على الفوكس، ممكن اللاين الفيس على اللاين.
الفيس ده زي موسيقى.
البراغيث.
بس ممكن لاين على سنيك.
ده البراغيث.
ممكن أي حاجة whatever.
كده خالص.
Okay. طيب. In a food web, if I ask you to name the trophic level of the fox. خلوا بالكم لما الاكزامينر يقول name the trophic level, he needs you to say whether it's a primary consumer, it's a secondary consumer, it's a tertiary consumer. لما يقول state the trophic level يبقى هتقولوا first trophic level, second trophic level, third trophic level. So هنا أنا بقول name يبقى I want to know which consumer it is.
Secondary.
Actually, in this food chain, it's a second consumer. In this food chain, it's a third consumer. So in a food web, you cannot name the trophic level of an organism because he's feeding at two different levels in two different chains. So what's the benefit of this? Less competition. Less competition between the foxes themselves. They have more food. When one of them gets extinct, they can feed on the other.
Less competition.
Less competition between the foxes because the foxes that cannot feed on the rabbits will feed on the birds. They have more types of food to feed on. Okay? That can support a larger population. And this is always the case. When you have a higher carnivore, you will always find them feeding in one of the food chains at a lower level. So they can get more energy and they can survive more. Okay? ماشي? But again, because this is an interconnected food chain in any food web, if anything happens to one of these consumers, all the food web will be disbalanced. So for example, if the grasshoppers increased, so they will feed on more grass, so there will be less food for the rabbits and less food for the cows, less food for the humans. The fox at the beginning might not be much affected because they can feed on birds, and the birds will already increase because they have more grasshoppers. So the fox might not be affected because the rabbits will decrease, but they can feed on more birds. So when scientists wanted to represent the relationships in the food chains, they decided to represent it in the form of a pyramid. A food pyramid, any pyramid big base, and then it tapers upwards. That's the shape of a pyramid.
بس هي مشكلة اللي هي
Any pyramid, any pyramid must have a wide base and then it tapers upwards. So that's the shape of a proper pyramid. Okay? So when they said we want to represent food chains in the form of pyramids, they meant they wanted this shape to appear at the end. So they started to represent it using pyramids of numbers. That was the first thing they decided to use, the numbers. So they went to the first trophic level and they started to count the number of all the existing producers in an ecosystem. And then they started to count the number of all the existing primary consumers, secondary consumers, and so on. So they got a pyramid where the base was the biggest, and that's the producers. And then the primary consumers were less in number, the secondary were less, and the tertiary were less. And they started to think about this pyramid, and they said, this makes common sense. Because usually, as you go up the trophic levels, the size of the organisms get larger. So the size of the tertiary consumer is bigger than the secondary. And the secondary is bigger than the primary. And whenever the size gets bigger, this means they need to feed on a larger number from the lower trophic level. Yani for example, for the secondary consumer to survive, it needs to eat 10 primary consumers, but the tertiary consumer needs 20 secondary consumers. The bigger the size, the more they need to eat. Yes, the amount of food available here will support a smaller population. Okay, so that's the pyramid of numbers. They were really convinced by these facts, and they started to apply this pyramid of number on all the known existing food chains that they know. In some food chains, they found that it wasn't giving a pyramid, because they had a food chain, for example, of an oak tree, so the producer was just one tree. And feeding on this tree, they had thousands of caterpillars. So the primary consumer was a much bigger number. And then feeding on these caterpillars were hundreds of birds. So the secondary consumer had a smaller number. But on each bird, there were thousands of fleas. So the tertiary consumer was a much bigger number. So they said, it's not showing a pyramid. It's not even an inverted pyramid. It's not a pyramid at all. So they said, we have to think on something else. So the pyramid of number cannot be applied in any food chain. We have to think of another representation. So they started to think by representing the relationship in the form of biomass. So they started to collect the mass of all the producers in an area, the mass of all the primary consumers, and they tried to make it on this ecosystem. So it gave more or less the shape of a pyramid. The producer had the largest mass, and the primary consumer is less, and so on. But other researchers and other scientists told them, biomass is an inaccurate measurement. We don't use biomass. Biomass is the mass of the organism with the water inside it. And the amount of water varies. It can vary in one day. So a plant that has just been watered and absorbed a lot of water will have a lot of water and its mass will be too heavy. But after it has transpired, the mass will decrease. So during a day, the mass is going to differ. The amount of water is variable. So biomass is an inaccurate measurement. I cannot use an inaccurate measurement for a representation. So they said, we cannot use this. we have to find something else. Yes? They said, we're going to represent it using energy. So when they tried to apply this pyramid, they found in any existing food chain, the greatest amount of energy was at the producer level, and then this energy starts to decrease as we move up the food chain. Because as we said, energy is lost at each trophic level. So at the end they said the most accurate representation is the pyramid of energy. Okay? So that's the footprint. It's very important for all living organisms. The living organisms need the nitrogen elements to make their amino acids, to make the proteins, to make the bases of the DNA and the RNA. So the nitrogen enters in all these structures. And the nitrogen is found as nitrogen gas in air. 79% of the atmospheric air is nitrogen gas. But living organisms, plants and animals, cannot make use of this nitrogen gas. For plants and animals to make use of the nitrogen, it has to be in the form of nitrogen compounds. So for plants and animals to use the nitrogen, first of all, this nitrogen has to be fixed in a process known as nitrogen fixation. So nitrogen fixation means that we have to convert the nitrogen gas in the air into nitrogen-containing compounds. Like, for example, the ammonium compounds. That's what's meant by nitrogen fixation. And to carry out nitrogen fixation, we have 3 different ways. The first method for nitrogen fixation is the Haber process. That's a man-made process. This is something that we do. You don't need to know the details of the process, but you need to know that this is made in factories where we make the ammonium fertilizers. Nitrogen-containing fertilizers that are going to be added to the soil. This is the process by which we make the chemical nitrogen-containing fertilizers that we add to the soil. So that's the Haber process. There's another method for nitrogen fixation that's a natural atmospheric method, which is the lightning. Lightning will carry out nitrogen fixation. It will cause a reaction to happen between the nitrogen and the oxygen gases, and they form nitrogen oxides that falls on the soil. But nitrogen fixation by lightning will mainly happen in tropical rainforests, where you have enough lightning to fertilize the soil. In a place like here, you cannot depend upon lightning to fertilize the soil. Okay? And لا هو بيعمل الرياكشن في الاير وبعد كده النيتروجين اوكسايدز بتدوب في المطر ميه المطر. Okay? The last process for nitrogen fixation, this is carried out by the nitrogen fixing bacteria. The nitrogen fixing bacteria is the only living organism that can carry out nitrogen fixation. It's the only living organism that can convert nitrogen gas into ammonium compounds and then use them to make amino acids. This is the only living organism which has the enzyme that can catalyze nitrogen fixation, nitrogen fixing bacteria.
ممكن decomposes عشان
No. The nitrogen fixing bacteria can convert nitrogen gas. Okay, it can carry out nitrogen fixation. And decomposers, they don't convert nitrogen gas. Yes, but they have to use organic compounds. They decompose organic compounds. Because they cannot use nitrogen gas. Okay, so they cannot carry out nitrogen fixation. But the only living organism that can carry out nitrogen fixation is the nitrogen fixing bacteria. The nitrogen fixing bacteria is found living inside nodules on the roots of leguminous plants.
بس يعني نوديول.
Nodules are swellings of the roots. So if this is the roots of the leguminous plants, you will find nodules, that's swollen areas, like swellings. These are nodules. If you take a nodule and you open it, you will find that this nodule is nothing more than a root cell with a very large population of nitrogen-fixing bacteria living inside it. So the nitrogen-fixing bacteria enters the cells of these roots and it starts to grow inside them.
اسمها ايه بلانت؟
Leguminous plants. البقوليات زي الفول فاصوليا لوبيا.
طب ولو بنزرع حاجة تانية؟
لا. No. It's only in leguminous plants. Okay? Right. What is this bacteria doing on these roots? It's living in mutualism, which means exchange of benefits, symbiosis. So the bacteria is going to take the sugar made by these plants during photosynthesis and is going to use it in respiration to get the energy needed. And in exchange, it will make amino acids for these plants. It will carry out nitrogen fixation for these plants. So the bacteria is living inside these roots. It's living there to take the sugar made by these plants to use it in respiration, to make the energy needed for its growth. Yani leguminous plants, they carry out photosynthesis and they make sugar. Some of this sugar will be used by these bacteria. In exchange of taking the sugar, the bacteria will carry out nitrogen fixation and give the plants amino acids. So the plant can make its proteins and grow. That mutualism, exchange of benefits. So leguminous plants can grow in soil with no nitrates. It grows independent of the nitrates in the soil. It doesn't need to absorb any nitrates from the soil because it has its own nitrogen-fixing bacteria. It has its own source, which is going to carry out nitrogen fixation for it. It doesn't need to absorb anything from the soil. Okay? So after nitrogen fixation, so that was the first process. After nitrogen fixation has been carried out, the nitrogen is now either found in the soil in the form of ammonium compounds, the fertilizers that we made, or the nitrogen will be found as proteins in leguminous plants from the nitrogen fixation of the nitrogen fixing bacteria. Bacteria بتعمل amino acids. The plants will use the amino acids to make their own proteins. Yes. بتعملها ammonium compounds. من ammonium compounds تعمل amino acids. Okay? We have the ammonium in the soil. The plants are the first to use this. But the plants, they cannot absorb ammonium. They absorb nitrates. So we need to convert these ammonium salts into nitrates so that the plants can absorb them be absorbed by the plants and used to make amino acids and plant proteins. So we need something to convert the ammonium to nitrates. This process is known as nitrification. It's carried out by a bacteria known as the nitrifying bacteria. The nitrifying bacteria is found in well-irrigated soil, and it converts the ammonium compounds to nitrites and then nitrates. It's an oxidation reaction. And so nitrates will be available for all the plants to absorb, and they make their own amino acids and proteins. Okay?
ما بيستخدمش البلانتس هو
مش الليجمنتس other plants. So after the nitrogen fixation and the nitrification, we have the nitrogen in the form of plant proteins. Okay? Those plant proteins, they are either going to be fed upon during nutrition. Animals will feed on these plants. They will digest those proteins into amino acids, and the amino acids will go to their cells to make their own proteins. Or, if the amino acids were in excess during excretion, the animals will excrete the urea in their urine, in the soil. The animals feed on the plants. Oh, the plants took the nitrates and made their own proteins. They made their own amino acids and proteins. And the leguminous plants already have their proteins. So now all the nitrogen compounds is in the form of plant proteins. So these plants, either the animals are going to eat them, and they are going to make their own proteins, and the excess amino acids will be excreted as urea in the urine, or these plants are going to die, and they go to the decomposers. And when the animals die, and ingestions of the animals, their feces as well, they go to the decomposers. The decomposers, they are going to secrete extracellular protease enzyme, which breaks down the proteins into amino acids. And the excess amino acids are deaminated into urea in the soil. And this urea is made of ammonia. So that's bringing back ammonium in the soil. So I have a small cycle. The nitrogen cycle is 2 cycles. There's a small cycle between the living organisms and the soil, and there's a bigger cycle between the air and the soil. So the small cycle is ammonium compounds converted to nitrates, absorbed by the plants, eaten by the animals, and then the ammonium is back to the soil either by decomposition or in the urine of the animals. So that's the small cycle. The big cycle is nitrogen gas. By nitrogen fixation, it forms the ammonium in the soil, and then we have the denitrifying bacteria, which is going to convert the nitrates in the soil into nitrogen gas. That's the big cycle. Yes, because you have 2 cycles. You can carry out the cycle in the soil only without the big cycle. And that's what we want, because the denitrifying bacteria, the farmer doesn't want it. Because the denitrifying bacteria is reducing the soil fertility. It's removing nitrates from the soil. So the plants will not have enough nitrates, they will not make amino acids, they will not grow properly. But this is something that you don't want. Okay? النيتروجين cycle هنذاكرها بالطريقة اللي أنا هلخصها دلوقتي. أول حاجة البكتيريا of the cycle. So we have 4 types of bacteria in this cycle. 3 good bacteria and 1 bad bacteria. Okay? The first bacteria is the nitrogen fixing bacteria. The nitrogen fixing bacteria is found inside nodules of leguminous plants. They are living inside the nodules of the leguminous plants. And the process that they carry out is the nitrogen fixation, which means it's going to convert nitrogen gas in the air into ammonium compounds and make amino acids. But that's only happening inside the roots of the leguminous plants. Okay? Then we have the nitrifying bacteria. The nitrifying bacteria is found in well-aerated soil. Soils that have enough air in the air spaces. The process it carries out is nitrification, which is converting the ammonium compounds to nitrites to nitrates. So that's the second good bacteria. The third bacteria is the decomposer. And again, it's found in well-aerated soil. The process it carries out is decomposition, where this bacteria will secrete extracellular protease enzyme to break down proteins to amino acids, and then it's going to deaminate these excess amino acids into urea, which is made of ammonia, and it returns the ammonium salts to the soil. The fourth type of bacteria is the denitrifying bacteria. This is found in water-logged soil with no air, with no oxygen, because this is an anaerobic bacteria. And the process it carries out is denitrification. It's going to convert nitrates in the soil to nitrogen gas in air. So it's reducing soil fertility. Okay? What increases the soil fertility? What's going to increase the soil fertility? The nitrogen-fixing bacteria is going to increase the soil fertility. The nitrifying bacteria is going to increase the soil fertility. The decomposers are going to increase the soil fertility. Okay? What's going to decrease the soil fertility? Denitrifying bacteria, denitrification. by plants and leaching of nitrates into the soil, into the water. When the nitrates dissolve in water and they leach into lakes.
مثل ايه absorption
The plants take the nitrates from the soil, they absorb it. So they remove nitrates from soil, it lowers the soil fertility. Okay? That's why when a farmer needs to increase soil fertility without using fertilizers, he usually carries out what we call the crop rotation. So the crop rotation is after the farmer cultivates a crop which absorbs a lot of nitrates from the soil, like for example rice. The rice absorbs all the nitrates from the soil, and the rice, they have to flood the soil with water, so it encourages the growth of the denitrifying bacteria. So after rice, the soil has no nitrates. So the farmer is going to plant a leguminous plant. The leguminous plants have their own nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the roots, so they can grow even if there is no nitrates in the soil, because the nitrogen-fixing bacteria will carry out nitrogen fixation. And after they cultivate the crop, the roots are left in the soil to decompose, and they are very rich in ammonium compounds. So they are going to release a lot of ammonium compounds.